They came before sunrise. Men in dark coats smashed our door and shoved my father. My mother screamed my name and my little brother clung to her skirt. A tall man shoved me down and pressed cold metal on my wrists. "You're under arrest," he said like it was a lesson. I could see my father's face on the floor, blood bright on the tiles. They yelled words I didn't understand, then called them evidence. They ripped papers from drawers and held up my mother's handwriting like it was proof we stole from people. My brother cried out and a guard hit him until he was quiet. My mother tried to stand between us and they pushed her hard enough that she hit the table and stayed there, breathing like she had no air. They put me in a van with men who smiled at the camera like we were props. They told me I was guilty. I felt the world tear, a thin sheet ripping and everything I loved falling through the hole. That moment burned into me. They destroyed my family and sent me to prison. I did not understand then how I would come back. The trial felt like a play where everyone knew their lines except me. The courtroom lights were too bright. The prosecutor spoke with a voice used to taking things. He showed papers with my name and a signature I did not remember making. A man I had never seen before stood and said I was part of a plan. My mother tried to speak for me, but the judge shook his head. The lawyer they gave me had a small voice and told me to say I was sorry. I wanted to scream the truth. We ran a small shop, we counted change, we loved each other. But they painted us as thieves. My brother was moved to a room far away. I saw him once through a glass wall, curled into a small ball. When the jury left and came back, the word guilty hit me like a door slamming. I watched my father's face fade like a picture in water. They read the sentence and I learned that words could lock you away for a long time. I was taken from the only home I knew. Prison smelled like iron and old coffee. The first night I lay on a thin bed and listened to the echo of bars closing. The other women moved like shadows. I learned the rules quickly. Keep your head down, don't show pain that others can use, and trade what you have for safety. My mother wrote me once. Her letters were small and shaky, full of love and fear. My brother's letters came at first, messy with crayons and small words, then stopped after a few months. I was 18 and the world had stolen my childhood. I made a promise to myself on a paper towel I kept. I would not allow them to break me into pieces. I read everything the library had and learned small skills. I practiced walking slowly, speaking little, and watching faces carefully. I wrote down names in a tiny book, those who had lied about us and those who had smiled when we fell. Each name was a seed I planted in the dark, waiting for the day I could pull it up and see its roots. Seasons changed behind the fences like pages turning. I used classes to learn things the outside world thought mattered, typing, numbers, rules. I listened to guards talking about businessmen on TV and notes passed about politicians and developers. Little pieces fit together in my head. A man wanted our land, a bank wanted a show to cover a loss, and someone needed a scapegoat. I began to map the leads in my head like a spider draws lines. It was not enough to be angry, anger was raw and short. I wanted a plan. I studied court reports I could find and practiced reading them like a code. I memorized phrases, dates, and the names that kept coming up. I imagined a slow return, not loud and burning but precise. I planned to use their own laws, their own papers, and the quiet mistakes they made. I sharpened patience until it felt like an arm I could lift again and again. 18 years of waiting was not empty. It became my training. When I walked out, the sun felt sharp, almost painful. The world I left was older and the town had changed. The bakery where my family had sold bread was empty, replaced by a for sale sign and new paint. My chest ached with the sight of that empty lot. A neighbor I barely knew cried when she saw me and told me about my mother's funeral. She said the headstone had been chipped and the name nearly gone. My brother had been moved through foster homes and then to distant family. No one had kept him. My father had died, alone in a hospital whose number I did not know. I had nothing but a small bag and a chest full of questions. I took a job doing data entry, quiet work that let me watch people and learn to blend in. I used nights to search records, following money like a scent. Every small paper I read was a clue. Each clue stitched together a picture of a plan that had been made to take our life. I promised myself I would not let it go. I learned to be invisible and to listen. Temp jobs brought me into offices full of files, ledgers, and callous conversations. One clerk mentioned a developer who bought properties quietly. Another spoke of transfers between banks and shell companies. I traced donations and found a line from the developer's firm to an account linked to the man who testified against us. Each connection felt like a thread I could tug. I wrote names in a little book and folded it into a sock I kept at night. I moved slowly and watched faces when I asked questions. People reveal themselves when they think you do not know. A cashier told me how a certain lawyer smiled at dinners with rich men. An old clerk mentioned a ledger someone tossed out years ago. I learned small lies and big ones. The deeper I dove, the more I realized the truth. Our fall had been planned with care. They had used the law like a net. If I wanted to catch them, I had to be cleaner and quieter than they expected. I met Matteo, the lawyer who liked puzzles. He came with a tired grin and a stack of old motions he said smelled of dust, the kind he loved. He wanted a case that mattered, not the small ones the firm gave him. Alma, the reporter, had a stubborn jaw and a notebook that never left her. Ben, a court clerk, had keys in his pocket and a habit of humming when nervous. I tested them with small facts, giving Alma a public record, letting Matteo look at a buried contract and trusting Ben with a photo. When they dug, the water around the truth started to stir. Matteo found a clause in an old foreclosure file that showed pressure from the developer. Alma traced a donation that matched a strange transfer. Ben quietly produced a blurry photo of my father at a dinner table with men who later testified against us. My hands shook reading it, but my voice stayed small. We were a bad team against a well-armed enemy, but we had something they forgot to bury: paper that breathes truth. I began to breathe a little easier. We hit the first real barrier when Ben got hurt. He was walking home with a folder I had not seen when a car struck him hard. The ambulance came and the police wrote a short report. The report had gaps like a toothless mouth. Ben lost the folder and his memory of the hit was foggy. He was scared and quiet in the hospital, and I hated being near him because he had keys to offices and names in his head. I watched his bandaged hands and felt anger like hot coal. The driver was never found. Alma wanted to run the story, but she had to be careful. Matteo said we were close, and that scared the men dealing in silence. I felt the choice press against my ribs: go loud now and risk losing our loose ends, or go slow and be smart. I picked slow. The men who had stolen our life used fear like an instrument. I decided to learn the tune and play a different song, one that would strip them of their masks in daylight. We got a small victory when a clerk at the bank named Elena slipped a copy of an old transfer into Alma's bag. Her hands shook as she did it, and she looked around like she expected men to come. The transfer showed a payment from the developer's company to a shell account, then to the lawyer who testified against us. Matteo verified it, and his eyes went very still. This paper would not prove everything, but it made the net tighter. I felt alive in a way I had not in years, not loud joy but a quiet, fierce hope. We started to plan how to turn the paper into a public truth. Alma wanted a headline that could not be ignored. Matteo wanted a legal path to reopen things. I wanted my brother back. We agreed on small steps: verify, secure, threaten with proof only when the path was clear. But the men who break things smell danger. Late that night I found a note under my door, a short line: stop. It was the first time I saw their real voice. I folded the paper into my sock and slept like the dead. The next twist came from my past. A woman who once worked at our shop reached out by mail. She had seen my brother after my arrest and remembered where he was taken first. It was a county home with a list of names and records that had been lost in a fire years ago. She said she always felt guilty for not telling me sooner. Her handwriting trembled and I read it 3 times. Matteo said records could be found if we pushed the right clock. Alma promised she would keep the story accurate and patient. I started visiting the county archive in the mornings before work. The building smelled of dust and old glue. I asked simple questions and let my eyes scan old boxes. One day, a box labeled wrongly opened with a faint sound like breathing. Inside, I found an intake form with my brother's name and a note about a transfer to a distant relative. The paper had a stamp from a social agency and a scribbled name. The last family we knew could be in another state. My chest tightened. This was a path to him, not just a memory. I folded the form into my pocket and felt a new kind of fear, hope that could be crushed. We moved slowly like surgeons. Matteo filed motions to get sealed records opened, using the new transfer evidence to push the judge. Alma wrote a careful piece about wrongful foreclosures and hidden transfers, not using names yet but painting a picture. The editor wanted a big headline that would sell, but Alma insisted on proof first. The men who had taken our lives started to shift in their seats. I watched them through news stories like animals that know a trap is near. Then we found another slip, a receipt for a donation from the developer to a charity run by the very man who had testified. The money clearly did not fit the charity's purpose. Matteo said the paper trail was now big enough to tug. The courtroom moves were slow, law likes the slow, and I had learned that speed can break things in wrong ways. I kept thinking of my brother's small face and my mother's hands. Each document was another step toward them. I felt the net tighten and the men whisper as if they felt the wind change. A sudden scare came when Matteo's briefcase was rifled through in his office. Papers were left scattered and a legal pad taken. The firm pretended it was a random break-in, but the pattern was clear. Someone wanted to unsettle us. Ben's repair shop had a window smashed the same night. The message was simple: stop or lose more. I thought of running away, but the years had changed me. Fear sat in my stomach like a stone, but it did not move me. Instead, I let it sharpen my plans. Matteo suggested keeping the most explosive papers in a safety deposit box and making digital copies hidden in encrypted files. Alma doubled her security, and Ben slept with a crowbar by his bed. We matched their moves with quiet defenses. I also started calling places where my brother might be, using the old intake form as proof we were connected. Each call felt like a small, hopeful push. People who hide often make small mistakes. We only needed one. Then came the break we needed. A whistleblower at the bank, a quiet teller named Rosa, handed over internal emails that showed the timing of the transfers. She left the copy in Alma's mailbox with a note: I couldn't sleep. The emails were short, the language used by people who believed themselves safe. They showed a meeting where the developer's agent asked the bank to make the paperwork pretty and to nudge a friendly witness. The witness was the man who had testified against us. Matteo's hands trembled as he read them and then went still. This paper was not a rumor, it was a sentence in their private talk. I felt a cold thrill of victory and a wash of pity for men who thought themselves beyond me. We planned the reveal. Alma would publish a careful expose with the emails and receipts tied together. Matteo would file motions to reopen our case. I bought a cheap phone and started to call the places from the intake form, trying to find my brother's trail. Each day felt like a tightrope. The day the article ran, the world shifted. People read and gasped. The paper showed emails, transfers, and the shaky witness photo. It did not accuse names directly, but the pattern was clear. The developer's office sent a denial. The man who testified hired a high-priced lawyer and said the article was full of lies. The city council called for hearings. Men who had smiled at dinners suddenly had to explain their schedules. I sat in a diner eating coffee and watched the news on a small TV. Matteo called and said the judge wanted to hear us. Alma said viewers had flooded her inbox. I felt a strange thing, not joy but a steady calm like a river pushing things that had been buried. Then a new twist hit. The man who had testified filed a countersuit for defamation. He claimed we had fabricated documents. The law had turned again, and the men we wanted to unmask knew how to use it. I felt fear not because I lacked proof, but because I knew they would stretch the rules to hide. We had to be ready for their counters. The countersuit forced our hands. Matteo filed a motion to admit the emails as evidence. The judge, old and careful, asked for originals. We did not have all originals. Ben and Rosa had to risk more to bring copies. Rosa typed a wire to her account and used it to hire a courier. Ben used a back door at the archive to pull a dusty ledger with my father's name. The man who had testified sat in the courtroom with a calm like glass. My heart beat loud. Mateo spoke with a steady voice, and Alma sat with a notebook that trembled in her lap. The judge allowed a limited hearing. We placed the emails on record and showed the transfers. The man's lawyer attacked each paper as fake. I felt like a small boat in a storm, but each wave we rode brought the shore closer. The hearing did not decide everything, but it opened doors. People started asking questions they had never asked before. I felt my brother's face in every shadow. The world was beginning to tilt. After the hearing, a strange ally appeared. A former board member of the charity where the donation had gone came forward. She had been pushed out years earlier and carried a folder in her bag that rattled like hope. She gave a sworn statement that the donation made no sense and that the man who testified had pressured her to accept its accounting. Her testimony added weight. Now the city council could not ignore the story. The developer tried to buy silence with lawyers, but money cannot fix everything. Mateo filed motions to revisit old evidence in my case. The motions asked for a real look at the files used to convict me. I slept poorly that week, always waking to check my phone. Alma's stories swelled with readers and the comment section filled with people who had felt cheated by power. I felt a new feeling. Other people's anger joined mine like a current. The men who had built a net around me were suddenly inside a clearing, and the clearing was full of witnesses. A blow came that felt like a betrayal. Ben disappeared for 2 days. His shop was locked and no one knew where he was. When he returned, his hair was messy and his eyes had dark circles. He said men had asked him to stop, that they had come to his door and warned his mother. He had been terrified and had hidden in a motel. He brought with him a battered box of old receipts he said he had smuggled from the bank. The receipts were messy and hand-stamped, but they lined up with the emails Rosa had given us. Ben's hands shook as he set them on the table. Mateo looked at them and let out a small breath. The fight had real faces now, people with cars, houses, and lawyers. I knew they could go further. I also knew retreat would mean losing everything. We decided to go to the press with everything at once. Alma prepared the largest piece she had ever written. I sat across from her and watched her type. When she called to say it was ready, my legs felt like gummy rope. The story would change everything if it was true, and if we were wrong it would bury us deeper. The day the full story published was cold and loud. Alma's piece showed emails, receipts, witness statements, and a map of transfers. People read and shared. The city council called an emergency meeting. The developer's stocks wavered and his office put out a statement full of promises. The man who testified denied everything, but his voice sounded thin. For the first time in years, men in suits had to explain themselves to a room full of people. The police opened an investigation into the original arrest. Mateo filed a motion to reopen my conviction. The judge agreed to a review. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched my life be examined like a watch. My stomach ached, not from hunger but from waiting. Then a new shock. My brother's last foster family came forward after reading the story. They had seen the article and wanted to know if I was his sister. I learned they had moved him to another state when he was small. I felt breathless. The trail was finally hot. Finding my brother took work. Mateo used subpoenas to pull records from across states. Alma's phone did not stop ringing with tips. I made calls during nights, waking early to listen for news. Finally, a social worker in a distant county remembered a small boy who'd been placed with a distant cousin. She sent a file with a name and a town. I booked a bus and traveled alone, heart knocking in my throat. When I arrived at the small house, a woman opened the door and looked at me like I was a ghost. Slowly, I said his name. Her face changed. She asked me to come inside and we talked like people untangling a knot. My brother had grown into a man with my father's eyes and my mother's stubborn jaw. He did not know about the letters, No one had told him who his real family was. When I hugged him, his body trembled like a leaf. I cried then, a sudden flood of all the lost years. He listened as I told him the story, and his hands twisted in his lap. He wanted to know everything. My brother, who now called himself Tom, needed time. He had built a life in a small town and feared upheaval. He was angry at what had happened, but also scared of the fight we were in now. He had a job, bills, and a past that included people who still liked the men who had taken our family. I did not force him. I gave him space and told him I would keep fighting. Mateo's motions to reopen the case moved slowly but clearly. The judge ordered a full review and a forensic audit of the bank records. The man who had testified was now a central figure in a widening investigation. The developer faced questions about his donations and transfers. The world we had been thrown from began to look smaller and more fixable. Tom started to come to meetings, sitting up straight and listening to Alma's reporting and Mateo's legal plans. I watched him and felt proud and sad at the same time. We both carried scars, but together we felt like a rope pulling someone from a well. A new twist came when my mother's old friend, an accountant, produced a small ledger kept hidden in a false bottom of a drawer. It had been left untouched for years, and the handwriting showed payments that matched our map. The ledger proved a pattern of bribes and hush money. It named names. Mateo entered it into evidence. The prosecutor's office, which had once stood against me, could no longer ignore the paper trail. They opened a separate criminal inquiry into those who engineered our ruin. Men who had seemed untouchable now faced questions and subpoenas. The city council held hearings full of sharp questions and angry citizens. People who had watched us suffer found a voice. I stood once in the hearing room and spoke about my family, my mother's hands, and the cold metal on my wrists. My voice did not shake. The room felt different, like the sun breaking through after a long rain. But the men we chased were clever. They hired stronger lawyers and began to fight back in quieter, more dangerous ways. They tried to scare us with a lawsuit aimed at Alma and me for invasion of privacy. Their lawyer sent envelopes with thick papers and thinner threats. But the court had seen enough to be wary. Mateo fought back with motions that showed the public interest. The judge refused to silence our story. Meanwhile, investigators found another link. A politician on the council had met with the developer before our arrest. The politician's phone records hinted at coordination. The more layers peeled back, the uglier the truth. I felt vindication, but it was not the bright kind I had imagined. Vindication felt slow and heavy, like water in a cup you lift with both hands. My brother watched me with a tight jaw, and sometimes I saw fear cross his face when a car lingered too long at the curb. We tightened our circle and kept moving. The men who wanted us quiet had resources, but we had evidence and a growing crowd that would not let the past be swept away. The court moved toward a big day, the review hearing to question the old witnesses. Mateo prepared like a sculptor planning a final cut. Alma's camera crew prepared a documentary that would air the same week. Ben shook his head at the pressure but showed up. Rosa testified and told how nervous bank clerks had been told to look the other way. The man who testified against us was in the chair and looked smaller than in old photos. He claimed memory failings and confusion. Under Mateo's steady questioning, his story unraveled. The developer stayed silent, shielded by lawyers. The judge listened and turned pages slowly. When the clerk called up the old files and the new proofs, the courtroom leaned forward like a crowd around a campfire. I sat beside Tom, our hands barely touching. Each witness who spoke to the truth felt like a small rope pulling our family closer. The hearing did not end everything, but it cracked a dam and the river started to run. The final twist came not with a roar but a small, bright sound. The prosecutor announced charges against several people: the developer's agent, the lawyer who testified, and a banker who had cleaned the transfers. They were arrested quietly and led out in cuffs. The city council began to vote on reforms to stop such abuse of power. Mateo filed papers to clear my name. The old conviction was reviewed, and in a private meeting the prosecutor offered a deal: vacate the conviction. I cried then, but not all the tears were relief. Some were for the years lost and the empty rooms at night. Tom hugged me in the hall and said, "We have to build again." We did not dance on their ruins. We made a list of repairs, claim the small memories, fix the places that hurt, and find the friends who had watched from the shadows. People who had helped us came forward and the community shifted like a tide. In the end, justice was not loud revenge but steady truth. My record was cleared. The men who had taken our home faced the price of their choices. Tom and I visited the old lot where the bakery had been. Wildflowers grew there now. We planted a small tree and a plaque that said we remembered what had been lost and would guard what was left. Alma's story won awards and Mateo got calls from firms wanting him to fight hard cases. Ben opened his shop again and Rosa kept working quietly, smiling when she saw us. I learned that revenge without heart becomes cruelty, but standing firm and seeking truth can change a city. I am still Julia. I still carry the memory of cold metal on my wrists and my mother's last look. But I also carry the memory of the team who helped, the small papers that became big truths, and the day I hugged my brother and he remembered who he was. They had destroyed my family once, but we had rebuilt the rest on honest ground. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and tap the bell to get notified the moment we drop a new story, and don't forget to like the video to help others find it.